vocabulary, so all of these words that either aren't used in the Gospel of Mark or aren't used anywhere else in the New Testament or aren't used in any of the Gospels and so on and so forth. So we talked about how in the last 11 verses, there's almost a completely new vocabulary that's being used compared to the first 16 chapters, right? And we talked about how authors don't do that. They don't write in one style with one vocabulary for 16 chapters and then change it in 11 verses. It doesn't make any sense. Which makes the most sense that somebody else wrote verses 9 through 20. And I also wanted to get to some of the other considerations. So we talked about before that the shorter ending is always preferred, because what we know from scribal tendencies, so that is, when you look at a bunch of manuscripts, what you see is that professional scribes had tendencies for the way that they would copy things. The tendency of scribes was not to delete or to take out, but to add to. So the scribes who were copying believed this, especially as you progress later into the Common Era, so 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, the scribes who were copying these believed these to be the inspired Word of God. And so they weren't very likely to take away from what God had said. But what they might do is add, normally for explanation. Like the thinking, my readers need a little bit more here. We also talked about how sometimes what happens is a scribe will make a note in a margin to explain, and another scribe thinks that it's supposed to be there and adds it to the actual text when they copy. So scribes had a tendency to add to, not to take away from. So you think of the ending of the Gospel of Mark, we're going to prefer a little bit the shorter reading, so ending at verse 8, than the longer of verses 9 through 20, because we know that scribes tended to add rather than to take away. The more difficult reading is preferred. And so scribes tended to change things to make them easier to understand, not harder to understand. And that probably makes sense to us, why scribes would do that. And when you think of the ending of Mark, the harder reading is an ending at verse 8, where you have an entire gospel that ends with the women were scared and afraid. If you remember that an angel appears to them, they're told, Jesus is risen, go tell the disciples, and the women don't. They don't because they're scared and afraid. End of the gospel. I didn't bring my Greek Bible in here. And ending at verse 8 has the Gospel of John ending with a, does it end, what word does it end with? I think the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mark, if it ended at verse 8, I think it ends with a conjunction. I think it's the Greek word gar, which is for. For they were scared and afraid. For comes at the end of that sentence, not at the beginning. So one of the way that Greek works is an author can put the most important words at the front of a sentence and tack on everything else that needs to be there at the end. It doesn't have to be in a particular order like English has to be. So you can put the first word of the sentence or the clause. So for connects the clause scared and afraid to which is a dependent clause, to the independent clause of the women were scared. Right? The women were scared. Why? The women didn't tell anyone. That's the independent clause. The women didn't go tell the disciples because they were scared and afraid. Why didn't they go tell anyone? Because they were scared and afraid. So that word for connects those two clauses. But in English, you have to have it between the two clauses. Right? In Greek, you can move it to the end of that second clause and emphasize that they were scared and afraid. So scared and afraid come at the beginning because Mark wants to emphasize that the women were scared and afraid, not to emphasize the connection to the previous clause, if that makes sense. So you have an entire book that's written with that it concludes with a conjunction, which is harder to explain, because I don't know about you, but how many books have you read that end with the word for or because? Not common in English, not common in Greek. And so that's one debate that scholars make of, is it possible in the Greek language to end a book with a conjunction? Like is that something that we have evidence is a possibility in Greek literature? And there is some close example, but nothing exactly like Mark, which is what makes explaining ending at verse 8 more difficult than verses 9 through 20. 9 through 20 are a nice, solid, explanatory ending. We like verses 9 through 20. Verse 8 leaves us wondering and guessing and asking questions. And so that's what we're going to prefer, because a scribe is much more likely to add in order to explain a nice, clean-cut ending than having a rigid ending.
In verses 9 through 20, is there anything that would change the plan of salvation?
No, it's, well, that's actually the next thing. That's what I'm going to get to. Which best explains the origin of the others? So, what scholars will try to do as they're looking at all this is they try to hypothesize a theory.
Thank you.
You're welcome. They try to hypothesize a theory of what could have happened to get these variety of endings in the manuscript tradition. And the best explanation is this, that I got to back up and say one more thing first. So, scholars who accept that the Gospel of Mark originally ended at verse 8 debate whether or not Mark, the author, intended for it to end at verse 8. That is, some scholars say Mark wanted his Gospel to end at verse 8. Some say the Gospel ended at verse 8, but it was because Mark never had an opportunity to finish it. So it wasn't supposed to end at verse 8, but nevertheless it did end at verse 8. And so scholars or scribes added to it. Some scholars say that the ending of the Gospel, so after verse 8, was lost. It was on a final piece of papyri that gets lost or torn out or something very early on. So you end up with the Gospel of Mark that ends at verse 8. So I say that to say, regardless of how Mark ends up ending at verse 8, the best explanation is somehow it ends up ending at verse 8, whether that was intentional or unintentional. It ends at verse 8. A scribe reading this does not like the ending. They don't like that the women are told to go and tell, and they don't, because they're scared and afraid. They don't like that it ends on a cliffhanger. Well, does anybody ever find out? They don't like the questions of, well, did Jesus really rise from the dead? This man tells them, but in Mark, he's not called an angel. So you don't know that he's from God. Some man, could be the gardener, tells them that Jesus rose from the dead. There's no body. We don't have in Mark any resurrection appearances of Jesus afterwards. And they don't like that it ends with a conjunction. They don't like that it ends with because.
There are other places in the Bible where people are told not to go tell because they want it to be told. And it's just like, tell somebody don't say it, or don't say it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm going to mention that here in a minute of what's going on in the Gospel of Mark. So, a scribe doesn't like that ending. There's a lot of reasons not to like that ending. And so they're like, well, I want to finish out the story. And the scribe knows how the story ends, because we have Matthew, we have Luke, we have the beginning of Acts. And so what's interesting is everything there in verses 9 through 20 can be found at the end of Matthew, at the end of Luke, at the beginning of Acts.
But Mark was written before those words.
Mark was, yes. And so probably in the 2nd or 3rd century, verses 9 through 20 get added to the end of Mark, so after everything is written. And what a scribe does is they take the ending of Matthew, the ending of Luke, the beginning of Acts, because they're like, we know how the story ends. They compile that all together, and you get verses 9 through 20, which is why it sounds so similar to Matthew, Luke, and Acts, and why the language changes from Mark, because Mark didn't write it. Matthew and Luke wrote it, and a little bit of the scribes' probably own words get added into it. So it makes the most sense. That is the best explanation that anyone has come up with. And in light of a better explanation, you are logically correct in accepting the best explanation you have available to you. Now, that leads to the question of how did the original Gospel of Mark end? Is it intentionally or unintentionally end at verse 8? I've changed my opinion on this. About 5 years ago, I wrote a paper where I argued that the original ending to the Gospel of Mark was lost, that I didn't think that Mark intended to end his Gospel at verse 8, but that he had written more, and that last sheet of the Gospel found its way missing very early on. I've since changed my opinion, and I now think that Mark intended to end his Gospel at verse 8. And I think that verse 8 is a beautiful ending to the Gospel. So, this is the way that Mark's emphasis is on discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? Mark is the harshest on the male disciples of any of the Gospel writers. His point is this: look at the disciples. This is not what it looks like to be a disciple. Discipleship looks different. So what does it mean to be a disciple or a follower of the suffering Messiah? Like that's part of Mark's point, is that to be a disciple of Jesus as a suffering Messiah means that one also suffers. That's kind of the point of Mark. Mark employs, which is where in the first half of the gospel, Jesus is identified as the Messiah. So people call him the Messiah. He heals them, and they're like, well, you must be the Messiah. Or Jesus comes across a man who is possessed by a demon, and the demon cries out that Jesus is the Messiah. And in the first half of the gospel, what does Jesus do? He silences the demon, so the demon can't tell anybody that he's the Messiah. And he tells the people that he heals, don't go tell anybody what's happened here. And the reason is because in Mark, Jesus is only identified as the Messiah when he's looked at on the cross. So in Mark, you only understand what kind of Messiah Jesus is when you see Jesus suffering, because Jesus is the suffering Messiah. So early on in the gospel, before he suffered, Jesus silences people because he's like, you can't fully understand what kind of Messiah I am now. You only understand it after my suffering. So he silences people. The problem is, everyone that he silences goes and tells. He says, don't tell anyone, and what do? They go and tell everyone, and the crowds begin to flock to Jesus. In the middle of the gospel, when he asks Peter, well, he really asks all the disciples, but Peter's the one who answers, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, some say that you're John the Baptist come from the dead, some say that you're Elijah, some say that you're one of the prophets. And Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And Jesus says that he is right, and then predicts his death. He says, because I'm the Messiah, I have to die. And what does Peter do? Peter's like, well, no. We're not going to let that happen. And that's when Jesus, the famous words, get behind me, Satan. So it's in this moment that Jesus has now identified himself. He says, I am the Messiah, and that I'm a Messiah that must die. And so at that point in Mark, it flips. Jesus stops silencing people, because we now know this is who Jesus is, and we start moving towards his actual death. But throughout all of this time, his male disciples following after him can't grasp what kind of Messiah he's supposed to be. The crowds can't grasp what kind of Messiah he's supposed to be. They think, he's come to establish a new kingdom. The disciples don't understand when Jesus predicts about his death. And then at the end of Mark, when Jesus is on the cross, the Gentile centurion standing there watches Jesus die and says, surely this was the Son of God. What's interesting is the Gentile centurion is the only one in the gospel who rightly identifies who Jesus is. Jesus is the Son of God who suffers and dies for the world. Nobody else understands that. And that's intentional in Mark, because his point is there, by looking at the cross, you know what kind of Messiah Jesus is going to be. Then Jesus raises. The women come and they find the tomb empty. The angel says Jesus is raised. Go and tell. It's the first time in the gospel someone is told to go and tell. For the first half of the gospel, people were told, don't go and tell. And what do? They go and tell. At the end of the gospel is a bit of irony. People are finally told, go and tell. And what do the women do? They don't go and tell. So the Gospel of Mark ends with a bit of irony. And his point is that true discipleship, he almost gives these examples of this is not what it looks like. Like, the women in Mark are much better disciples until chapter 16. Like, they far outdo the male disciples all the way throughout. And then they fail a little bit at the end. And I think Mark's point is not just to end with this bit of irony, but to say that disciples of Jesus are ones that follow in the footsteps of the Messiah who suffered, which means that you're going to have to suffer. It means that you're going to have to do things that sometimes you're scared and afraid of, like the women do. That's what it means. It means that you're like the centurion who looks up at Jesus on the cross and says, surely this was the Son of God. It means that you don't do some of the things that the disciples do, the male disciples throughout the gospel. It also means that you don't do what the female disciples do at the very end. You do go and tell. And so in many ways, I think the Gospel of Mark ends on a cliffhanger in that it ends open-ended. It's asking the question, what are you going to do? Those of us reading it, what are you going to do? Are you going to be like the male disciples in the first 15 chapters? Are you going to be like the female disciples in the end who don't go tell? Or are you going to be a true disciple of the suffering Messiah and follow in his footsteps and go out into the world and declare the things that you have seen and heard? And so I actually think an ending at verse 8 is a beautiful work of literature that Mark is trying to do. So that is all to say that I think the Gospel of Mark originally ended at verse 8. Now, I said this last week, that leaves with, well, what do we do with verses 9 through 20? Like, we have them in our Bible, whether they're in a footnote or bracketed off or something like that. And my suggestion to people is always, like, people debate, do you use it or do you not use it? I'm on the side of, let's not use it because it's also found in Matthew, Luke, and Acts. Like, if you need something that's there, go to Matthew, Luke, and Acts, something that isn't disputed. Because I mentioned before, especially if you're talking to someone who's a non-believer, let's say, most non-believers or atheists that I know the Bible more than most Christians that I know. And what that means is if you try to prove a point with Mark 16, I would say 8 times out of 10, they're going to know that that's a disputed text. And rather than talking about the issue, whatever you're talking, let's say you're talking about baptism and you want to go to Mark 16:16. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. That's the topic. You go to Mark 16, they know that it's disputed. Your debate is now whether or not that was original or not. It's not about baptism. Versus if you go to Romans 6, which isn't disputed, you can actually talk about baptism instead of talking about textual criticism. And so that's always my suggestion. It was pulled from the other Gospels, so I think the things in there are true and truthful. I just think in the grand scheme of trying to witness to the world, which is what Mark wants us to do, I'm not sure it's the most helpful place for us to go. And that goes to your point of it doesn't change anything because it's found in other places, and I think sometimes better in other places. I think I mentioned Historically in Churches of Christ, we've loved Mark 16:16 for baptism, but I think Romans 6 is a much better place to go, even if Mark 16:16 was original. I think there's more depth to Romans chapter 6. Questions? All right, turn to Ephesians chapter 1. We'll do one more. I find this stuff fun. I don't know if y'all enjoy it
We know you do.
at all, but
We're so glad you do.
go to Ephesians chapter 1. I actually, in a test in graduate school, I had to argue whether or not the phrase "in Ephesus" in Ephesians chapter 1 was original to Paul's letter or not. So, there we go. Okay. Ephesians 1 and verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, to the saints who are in Ephesus and are faithful in Christ Jesus. There around the phrase "in Ephesus and are faithful" or something to that effect, do any of your Bibles have a footnote? Does anybody want to read it? What is?
Some early manuscripts do not have "in Ephesus."
Yes. Reading, rather, saints who are faithful. So some manuscripts say to those who are in Ephesus and are faithful. Some say to the saints who are faithful, with no recipient. So that means we don't actually know who the letter to the Ephesians was written to, because some manuscripts say it was written to the faithful ones in Ephesus, so the Ephesians. Some manuscripts say it was just written to faithful saints somewhere in the world. And so here's the evidence for it. When you look at the manuscripts, the inclusion of the phrase "in Ephesus" is found in the second corrector of Sinaiticus. And what that means is that certain manuscripts were written, and then somebody comes along and makes some edits or corrections to it. So Sinaiticus, a big time, very important manuscript, which was written in the 4th century, originally did not have the phrase "in Ephesus." A corrector, after the 4th century, comes along and adds the phrase "in Ephesus." It's also the second corrector of Vaticanus, also written in the 4th century. The two most important manuscripts of the New Testament that we have are Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. They're very important. So what they say is very valuable. What's interesting is that neither one of them had the phrase "in Ephesus" originally, and somebody came later and added it. If you're thinking about history, to me that's very interesting, that of the early evidence that we have of the phrase, it was mostly all added secondhand. It was not original. The original hand of Sinaiticus, the original hand of Vaticanus, did not have the phrase "in Ephesus." P46, dating from the 2nd century, one of our earliest manuscripts in existence, does not include the phrase "in Ephesus." So you have 4th century, 2nd century that say it shouldn't be there. The ones that you have there that were original are 5th century and 6th century. So later witnesses say that the phrase "in Ephesus" should have been there.
Why did they name it Ephesians?
So what happened happens is, if you look at this evidence, it seems that by the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 5th century, the phrase "in Ephesus" gets added to the letter, and from the 5th century on, it's included in the manuscript tradition. So, for most of history, there was this, it said that it was written to the saints in Ephesus. And so when the book was named, at that point in time it had the phrase "in Ephesus." It was called Ephesians. Like when Paul's writing to the Corinthians, we call it Corinthians, or to the people in Thessalonica, Thessalonians, Colossians, Galatians. And so that's how it becomes named Ephesians, because the addition was added later on. So, we think of the considerations. The manuscript evidence seems to suggest that "in Ephesus" shouldn't be there, because the earliest evidence says it's not there. The later evidence is what says it is there. And of that later evidence, a lot of it is corrections to manuscripts that didn't originally have it, and "in Ephesus" gets added in. Again, some of the principles that scholars use. The shorter reading is preferred. So a scholar is going to be more likely to add the recipients in Ephesus, right? If a scribe is copying this, right, and they know, or at least they think they know, who the letter was written to. This letter was written to the Ephesians, but it doesn't say that in here. They're going to be much more likely to add "in Ephesus" than to take away the recipients, right? That doesn't make any sense. Now we don't know who the letter's to.
Is there any other referral to Ephesus in
No.
the book?
No, if you take out the phrase "in Ephesus," there is no reference to a specific locality anywhere else in the book.
So, moving down, verse 15 says, "For this reason, ever since I heard about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all God's people." So Paul is talking, like he's talking to someone specifically, and just keeping that in mind. So if the people, because they were receiving these letters, correct? They were going out to these different churches, they were receiving them. So if it was found in that town, that if the manuscript was found in that town, in the temple, where they kept their important documents, then that would lend credit to the scribe adding "in Ephesus," because they would historically know that this was in the temple in that town, and so we're going to add that in for future people to be able to understand.
So, Paul, we know what we do know. Like I said, there's not a reference to a specific locality, but there is references that we know that Paul knows the people that he's writing to.
But it's not us. I mean, we're taking it as we're including ourselves in this, but he was actually writing that letter to someone. To
some specific people that he obviously cared about and knew and had a relationship with and had heard about, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the best explanation of what is happening here. If you read through Ephesians, and I think this would be a fun exercise for you to do, but we'll put quotations around fun. Read through Ephesians, and then read through a letter like 1 Corinthians, and you'll notice a difference. So when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he's very specific about their problems. He's like, you have come, 1 Corinthians 11, you have come to the Lord's table, and when you do, you're divided, so you're not actually taking the Lord's specific problem. You have a man in your church who's sleeping with his mother's wife. You might want to deal with that. Right? Very, very specific. These are your problems. These are why they are problems. This is why you need to fix it. Here's how you fix it. Very specific. And in a lot of Paul's letters, you see that. 1st, 2nd Corinthians is a prime example because there's so many problems there. Philippians, if you remember at the end, he addresses two women specifically. He says, Yodi and Syntyche, get your act together and stop arguing with one another, right? Very specific. Nothing like that in Ephesians. Ephesians is about as general of a letter as you can get. So he says things that we know he knows his recipients, but he doesn't address any specific problems. It's very general. So, to me, the best explanation is we know that Paul intended for his letters to be circulated. That means for churches to share letters. So again, going back to his letters to the Corinthians, he tells them, when you receive this, read it, and then give it to the Laodiceans. And have the Laodiceans give you their letter, and you read each other's letters in your churches next. So Paul had an intention of people exchanging letters. So it's possible that Paul wrote this letter to a region, not to a specific town, but to a region that was made up of churches that he had a relationship with. And so it's a general letter because he's not addressing specific problems in one church, but he's encouraging a series of churches in a region. The region, most likely, would have been Asia Minor, which included Ephesus. But it might not have been written to Ephesus, but Ephesus might have been one of the 3, 4, 5 churches that Paul wrote this letter to and intended for them to then be passed around. Scholars have even argued that this is the letter to the Laodiceans, because Laodicea is near Ephesus in the region of Asia Minor. So if Paul wrote this as a general letter to the region, it would have included Laodicea. So some have argued, I don't think their argument is convincing, but some have argued that this is the letter that Paul is referencing when he's writing to the Corinthians. But the point being, this would also be the only letter that Paul writes if he doesn't address recipients, where he just says the saints who are faithful. And again, that fits with, well, if he's writing to a region, he's addressing all of the Christians in this region and expecting them all to benefit from them. And so he doesn't add a specific recipient because there's not one. There's just a group. There's just a region. And since Ephesus was in that region, and maybe Ephesus was the first church that the letter arrived to, maybe it was the last church where the letter arrived. Maybe it was where somebody found the letter.
That's what I'm thinking.
Ephesus gets attached to it because they're like, we know that Ephesus received this letter, though it probably wasn't merely intended for Ephesus. Now, this is another example, going back to your point, that doesn't change our theology much, but it might change our interpretation of Ephesians, because there's certain things in Ephesians that we have intended to interpret solely based on some of the pagan cults that existed in Ephesus. And while we may be right in doing that to an extent, if it wasn't just for the Ephesians, then we might have to widen our interpretation of what Paul at least was originally saying. What Paul's saying to us probably doesn't change a whole lot. Questions?
Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
a lot of his message had to do with, like you said, the new converts into Christianity and stuff. Wouldn't that basically be almost everybody during that time period? So I guess that's helps in the idea that it wasn't just at Ephesus.
Well, and Paul established tons of churches, a lot of them in the same region of the world. And like I said, Paul tells them, exchange letters. So it's not hard to believe that Paul writes a general letter to a region of the world rather than to a particular locality. Like, you just read Paul's missionary journeys in Acts, and it's like, well, that would make sense for Paul to do. Now, granted, Ephesians would be the only example of Paul ever doing that, but it becomes the best explanation for the facts that we have. So I'm out of time, but I'll get philosophical just for a second. There's a philosophical principle called Occam's razor. Occam's razor states that the simplest solution is the best. So the idea is, all things being equal, and you have two possible solutions, and everything else is equal, you choose the simpler one. And the logic behind that is, in the natural world, things don't tend to complicate themselves for no reason. So you take the simpler solution. And so that's why I say, like, logic would dictate when we're looking at Ephesians. The simplest solution seems to be, of the evidence that we have, if in Ephesus wasn't original, simplest solution is, well, Paul was writing a letter to a region. Now, you could come up with some very convoluted and complicated answers that also explain all the evidence. But to me, that's the simplest explanation that explains all of the evidence we have available to us. So, it's likely the correct explanation. Not that y'all cared about getting philosophical this morning. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop talking there. Next week, we're going to talk about the confession of the Ethiopian eunuch. And since that's the only one I have in my notes to talk about, we'll also talk a little bit about the woman caught in adultery. That's another interesting
You
one.
keep referring to churches. What you're actually saying is congregations.
Yes and no, depending on how you want to define the two. Because when I think of I don't know, when I think of congregations or groups, I tend to think of all the churches in a town. But most towns would have had multiple house churches that were connected to one another. And so you kind of have a little bit of both going on. Like Philippians, I think the reason Paul is so upset with Euodia and Syntyche is I think they're women of means, and you have two house churches that meet in their individual houses that now they're not communicating well to one another. So you've got these general groups in individual towns, but then you can also narrow down, you have multiple house churches. So it would be like, you think of a big city like Houston, where you have multiple churches or congregations. You also have that going on just on a much smaller scale. So yes, depending on how you're defining those terms, right? But you have
You
both going
relate
on.
that to modern day terms. It's kind of misconstrued or